you ever think back on the series and just shake your head and at something so improbable? I mean, it went absolutely the way it shouldn't have gone. Right from the first game of the series, right down to the last 34 seconds. I mean, did you ever have a feeling that there's some kind of a sense of destiny that's involved in all of that?
What up, Mike? Toronto. VK on the beat. Check. I'm in Toronto where you wanna get the city love. I'm from Toronto where you wanna get the city love. I'm in Toronto like we wanna get the city love. My city love me back for my city love.
Welcome to episode 1757 of Toronto Mic'd. Proudly brought to you by the new and improved Toronto Mic'd Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Toronto Mike to become a member today. By Great Lakes Brewery, a fiercely independent craft brewery who believes in supporting communities, good times, and brewing amazing beer. Order online for free local home delivery in the GTA. Palma Pasta. Enjoy the taste of fresh, homemade Italian pasta and entrees from Palma Pasta in Mississauga and Oakville. Toronto's Waterfront BIA. Check out what's happening on Toronto's waterfront this summer. Blue Sky Agency, the official distributor of Silent's quiet, comfortable, and customizable office pods. Create sanctuary within your workspace. RecycleMyElectronics.ca. Committing to our planet's future means properly recycling our electronics of the past. And Ridley Funeral Home, pillars of the community since 1921. Joining me today to discuss the life and legacy of Ken Dryden, it's the host of the Paikin podcast, Steve Paikin. How you doing, Steve?
Excellent, Mike. Happy to be with you, although wish it were a happier occasion.
The author, well, prolific author, really, and the man behind NotThePublicBroadcaster.com, actually in the basement with me right now, it's Bruce Dowbiggin. How you doing, Bruce?
Good to be here.
And making his Toronto Mike debut, he's actually in a hotel room in Edmonton, Alberta right now. It's the Member of Parliament for Etobicoke Lakeshore. Welcome to Toronto Mike, James Maloney.
Thanks, Mike. Thrilled to be here. I wish my first time here was a happier subject matter, but it's an honor to be with you guys.
Well, I'm glad all three of you are here. Now, I want to hear from all three of you. I'm sure that won't be a challenge, but much like our very own Steve Paikin here, Ken Dryden was Hamilton born, but raised in James, your district, good old Etobicoke. Where do we begin with a man who, I'm a little bit younger than you three, but when I look at the life of Ken Dryden, it's almost like he lived 5 prolific, amazing lives. Like there's so much meat on that bones, but where does your experience with Ken Dryden begin, Bruce?
In my column today, I write about it, and for me, Ken was kind of the 1970s version of what we thought Canada was best about. When you looked at his resume, when you looked at the kind of guy he was, this is what we thought we were. It was the age of Trudeau had just come in. We were now a global kind of presence, etc. We had just won the 72 series. There was this whole sense of pride and the whole sense of momentum about Canada. And a guy like Ken Dryden sort of represented that. He was bright. He was, he could do whatever you wanted to. If you were a media guy, you wanted him on CBC to talk about something political, he could do that. He could talk hockey. And you know what? He had a little bit of grit, too. One of the stories I tell in the column, and I told this story yesterday, and the thing I think typifies him is in 1973, he'd won 2 Stanley Cups with the Habs, and he went for his renegotiation, and the general manager of the Montreal Canadiens, Sammy Pollock, said basically, here's $25, a gift certificate from Harvey's, and a pat on the back, and that's what you're going to play for this year. And in those days, that's what the general managers did. And I don't think so. I don't think, oh, yeah, you'll play for it. He said, no, I'm going to go get my law degree. And he went for the year, and for people who weren't here at the time, everyone said, oh, he's only gone till Thanksgiving. He's only gone till Christmas. He's only gone till the playoffs. And he stuck the whole thing out. And in the year he was away, the Canadians got eliminated in the semifinals. They gave up 60 more goals than they had given up the year before. And Ken came back, and he basically looked at Sammy Pollock and said, okay, we're doing it my way. But he was, he never lorded it. You never heard him do interviews saying, I showed you, etc. He just was a great example of a kind of guy, the kind of person you want to be. And it's not something that I think necessarily carries over to today, the values.
Well, here's how I think we tackle the life and legacy of Ken Dryden. Maybe we start with Ken, the hockey player. Hell of a player, right, Steve?
Well, yes, but I think if that's what you want to do, you miss the biggest part of the story, which is when somebody is that excellent at playing hockey, you just can't imagine that they could be that excellent at anything else, because it takes so much to be that excellent at one thing. And yet, this guy, to this day, I think I'm right about this, today, to the date, he has still got the highest winning percentage of any goaltender in Stanley Cup playoff history. He's still at the top of the list of goaltenders. And yet somehow he managed not only to be a fantastic goaltender, but a fantastic author, a fantastic documentarian, a fantastic champion of education, just a guy, well, look, he was a great president of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Those were in the days when the Leafs actually went deep into the playoffs, although they didn't win the Stanley Cup, but they went deeper into the playoffs when Ken Dryden was there. And look, this guy was a really good member of Parliament and a really good cabinet minister. He managed to negotiate childcare agreements with every province in Canada and gave us our first national childcare program ever. Now, when the Harper government came in, it eliminated the whole thing, and I know he was crushed by that, but the fact is he was the first guy in history to get that done. So, Mike, to me, that's the story. Not how many Vezina trophies, how many Calder trophies, how many Stanley Cups. That's only part of the story. The biggest part of the story is that he was fantastic at that, and it's so many other things at the same time, which is really hard to do.
Making your Toronto Mike debut, James, tell me about your experience with Ken Dryden.
Well, look, Steve's absolutely right. I mean, talking about him only as a hockey player leaves out, some of the biggest parts of his life. But you have to, because that's how everybody who knows him, that's where it began. Anybody over a certain age in Canada remembers Ken Dryden from Team Canada 72. At the risk of alienating some of my constituents, I grew up a Montreal Canadiens hockey fan, and he was one of my heroes. Even when I saw him as an adult, I couldn't get over that sort of hero worship type feeling whenever I saw the man. But, he lost 57 regular season games, 6 Stanley Cups in 9 years, 5 Vezinas. His hockey record is impeccable. He took that year off and articled to become a lawyer. He's also incredibly principled. But as an author, and I remember this, I read the game twice. And the first time I read it, you hang on every word. The man had the ability when he wrote, but also when he spoke, he would say something and my reaction would be, yeah, that's what I think, but I couldn't possibly have put it in such a way that I could understand it like that. He had an ability to sort of capture feelings and emotions that very few other people did. His record was incredible, but the childcare piece, people forget about that. That was a monumental accomplishment because he became a minister after the 2004 election, and within just over a year, he had agreements with all 10 provinces. It was all teed up. It was all ready to roll out. And then we went into the election, as Steve mentioned, and Stephen Harper won. And it wasn't until 3 years ago that child care got, put back on the agenda. But that's really a Ken Dryden story. And when I tell people involved in politics about it now, most people don't know that part about him. The man was a big thinker. He was, he thought about a big Canada. And I admired the guy so much. And, if you look at, I'm going to go on a bit here. If you look at what he did in the years after he left hockey, he was very passionate about the game and the state of the game and head injuries and concussions. If you look at the work he did there, it's really remarkable. He spoke about it. He wrote about it. I was in Parliament. It was in 2019. And Gary Bettman and Bill Daley were coming in to testify before the Health Committee about head injuries in sports. I wasn't on the committee at the time, but I sort of inserted myself into the proceedings, and I started asking questions, and some of my colleagues started ceding their time to me because they realized I knew a lot about the game and I was asking interesting questions. And, I got into it with the commissioner about what they're doing to, work towards that. And he talked about the player, or the position of player safety. And I pointed out to Bettman that every person he'd ever appointed to that job was somebody who never was eligible for the Lady Byng Award, and there was a certain irony there. I suggested to him, look, if you want to find a solution to make hockey better, you lock Ken Dryden and Don Cherry in a room and don't let them out until they agree on what the rules are going to be. Because you've got sort of the balance of power there. But because of that, Ken reached out to me a number of times on the subject, and it was something he cared deeply about. Like his care for the game was, it was from the heart.
How did you end up a Habs fan?
Well, I have a lot in common with Ken Dryden. We both grew up in Etobicoke, but we were born elsewhere. In my case, I was born in Thunder Bay. And when I was a kid in Thunder Bay, Hockey Night in Canada was always the Montreal Canadiens. My two older brothers were Habs fans, so that's how it started. So I say I have a lot in common with them. We were both born elsewhere. We both grew up in Etobicoke. We both played for Humber Valley. We both became lawyers. I don't have 6 Stanley Cups.
Oh, that's that. Okay, so Ken and I also have a lot in common. We're both born in Hamilton. We both love politics. We both love hockey. And between the two of us, we've won 6 Stanley Cups.
Exactly. Yeah, and we were both MPs, so it's just, we both fall short there a bit, Steve.
Well, hold my beer. Now, hang on a second. Between him and me, I think we probably have about 20 books. I think that's the closest. No cups and 20 books. But if I could say one thing about it, and this might sound like I'm overdoing it, but I think that the game is the greatest narrator, participant, nonfiction sports book that ever's been written. And
Hear. Agree with you,
what James is talking about, and the thing that you're talking about, James, is when you're reading it, is he has the perspective of the guy who is there, but he also has his eyes up in the stands looking down. And that's so hard as all of us who write, trying to find that voice that sort of transcends it. And he transcended it, and he was funny. If you read that book again today, you'll know stuff about 1980s Montreal. It was a referendum year. He gets into that, the dynamic, the French-English dynamic on the team. But then he's also funny about Guy Pointu, as he calls him, and all of his pranks and things that he played. It's kind of like Jim Bouton's book Ball 4, but just a little more erudite. And I'm willing to take on anybody in an argument about it who thinks there's a better kind of, as I say, first-person voyeur book in nonfiction sports.
Well, you won't get the argument from me. I can assure you that. I feel exactly the same way.
Yeah, and his books that he did with Roy McMurtry. Home Game there's some brilliant stuff in there about the relationship between players and their fathers. Stuff that I drew on when I was writing other books. Roy and he were a really good combination too. I think Roy brought out great stuff in Ken, and obviously they did some of the stuff on video as well.
I love being able to correct Bruce Dowbiggin. I don't think it was the former Ontario Attorney General he wrote the book with. I think it was Roy McGregor.
Did I
not
say
McMurtry?
Roy? Oh yeah, it is Roy. Sorry, I got my Scots wrong. What are those Scots? Yeah, no, it wasn't Roy McMurtry. It's Roy McGregor, and they did do a bunch of books. And Roy was, of course, at the Globe.
Yeah.
Now,
so I should know better.
Yeah, he just wrote a book which I haven't read yet. It's a book growing up in Etobicoke and going to ECI.
Oh, it's one of his best, James.
I haven't read it yet. Best. And I was going to reach out. I didn't look, I'll be honest with you. I shed a tear on Saturday morning when I saw the news. As I said, these guys were my heroes. But I was going to reach out to him because growing up in Etobicoke and sharing the interests as we do, I wanted to come and I was going to organize an event at ECI with him and get him, invite the community to come out and hear it from him firsthand. It's unfortunate, but again, I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm sure I'll have the same reaction I did when I read his other book.
Steve, you should tell the story. Class. Yeah, you should tell the story, Steve. You told us yesterday. We were doing something in Aurora yesterday. Tell the story about this last year and the suggestion of the documentary. That sequence that you told us, I think it was really eye-opening about who Ken was.
If you mean the story where he called me up and he said, he says, I got a story idea for you for the agenda, this show I used to host on TVO. And I said, he said, can we get together and I'll pitch you the idea? Or no, sorry. He just said, I'm going to call you. That's right. He wasn't well enough to go out, and that should have been a heads up to me. But anyway, he said, we spoke on the phone, and he said, what are we going to look back at 50 years from now and say to ourselves, how could we possibly have allowed that to happen? He said, Steve, you remember when we were on, when people were allowed to smoke on airplanes or in elevators or in movie theaters, and back at the time, nobody really thought much about it. But 50 years later, we look back and think, how could we possibly have allowed that? He said, I think you should do a show on what are we going to look back at 50 years from now and say, how could we possibly have allowed that? And of course, he was coming at it from an angle, as James suggested, of headshots in hockey. He's 50 years from now, he would have said, how could you possibly have allowed the amount of headshots in hockey that you're permitting today without absolutely wringing it out of the game? And I went to the brass at TVO and I told them about it. They loved the idea. We ended up doing the show, and it was a typical Ken Dryden, iconoclastic, interesting, intelligent, quirky, kind of a program. Really quite lovely. And we had a few other people on. And again, that was the last week of June. And he said he had so much back pain that he could not come into the studio to do the show with us. And so we had to do it on satellite from his home in Midtown Toronto. And I should have guessed, that's only 3 months ago. I should have guessed something was up, but I didn't. And that was the last time we spoke.
Steve,
was that show.
It sounds like you had a pretty good relationship with Ken. Maybe elaborate. How close were you to Ken Dryden?
Well, how close was I to Ken Dryden? We spent a lot of time emailing together. He certainly, every time he came out with a book, I wanted to have him on the agenda and talk to him about his book. And we certainly did one on the class, the Etobicoke Collegiate Institute book that James referred to earlier, which was such a brilliant piece of work. He just basically got in touch with everybody who was in his high school graduation class and just said, what's going on in your life now? And he spent hours with each person and really spun a wonderful yarn about all that. He was very interesting on email. So we got together on the show. We would get together for lunch. We would email quite a bit. He was a very tough viewer. Like, he wasn't the kind of guy who would suck up. He'd send me an email and saying, you didn't do well on this question, and you really needed to be tougher on this question, that kind of thing. Some of the emails would go on for quite a long time. Others would be absolutely delightful. There was a time I'm at home working, and I see I've got whatever channel on, and they're replaying the 1976 Stanley Cup final between the Canadiens and the Philadelphia Flyers. So I emailed him right away, and I said, hey, you're on TV. They're showing this old game. You should watch. He said, absolutely not. I never watch. And I said, why not? And he emails me back, and he says, well, we won at that time, but if I watch it this time, who knows how it might turn out, which I thought was pretty funny. And then I said, no, seriously, you never watch yourself like the old games when they're on? You don't watch? And he said, no. He said, I remember I have an image in my head of what I looked like and sounded like and played like back then. And I want that to be what stays with me. I don't want to look at it 40 years after the fact and think, oh, that's what it looked like. So anyway, a mixture of humor and brilliance and so iconoclastic. Yeah, lovely.
And Bruce, what about your personal interactions with Ken Dryden?
Well, we had a lot of interaction because every time I was writing a book and I needed somebody who had an IQ over a fence post in the hockey world, he was the first guy I called. And we ran into each other a little bit from time to time. And of course, obviously, I had to cover him with the Leafs. I remember the famous episode where I think Pat Quinn was throttling Howard Berger in an elevator, and Ken had just become the president of the Leafs, and it was not a good time for the Leafs. And that was one of the things I had to cover with him. But I told this story yesterday. We're sort of hearkening back to this event yesterday, but I told this story yesterday, and I'd known Ken for, I guess, 20 years. And I'd flown in for the 2001 NHL draft in Miami. And I fly in, and it is a monsoon. Well, anybody who's spent any time in Florida knows when it rains. It rains. So I get in there, and I'm picking up my rental car, and this lonely figure on the other side of the car rental place, it's Ken Dryden. And he says, "Oh, hi, Bruce. How you doing?" I said, "Okay." He said, "Can you give me a ride to the hotel? My reservation didn't work out." Yeah, sure, absolutely. And it was raining so hard, we couldn't barely see the road. We had to pull over a couple of times as we went along. But the whole time we had a chance to talk. And we started off, and he was asking me, first of all, how do I like Calgary? I had just moved there. What's it like? What are the Flames doing, etc. We had that kind of thing. And then he segued into, we've been talking about some of his passions, and one, of course, was CTE, the headshots. He hated what had happened with hockey, Jacques Lemaire, and the trap. He thought that goalies were wearing too much, getting away with too much equipment, and he thought the game was being dumbed down, etc. And in this 45-minute drive to get to the hotel, we're talking about all these things. First of all, I'm afraid we're going to get killed going the wrong way on a street because we couldn't see. This is before Waze and all that. Sure. And we get to the end, and we get out of at the hotel and walk in, and Ken says, "Here's $40 for the gas." I said, "Thank you." And the media guys are all in the lobby, as they always are, and this scene is witnessed by a bunch of them, and they're kind of like, "Whoa, what's going on?" First of all, has he just gotten the story on what the Leafs are going to do with the draft, et cetera, et cetera? And Ken goes to them, and he shoos them away. And then finally, Howard Berger, the sainted Howard Berger, comes over to me, and he says, "Well, I can't believe that." And I said, "Well, I just, it's nothing." He said, "No, Ken's the most frugal, cheap guy I've ever met, and he just gave you $40. And I thought that was so cute about Ken, and that he's kind of Mr. Burns' character when it came to tipping and people. Anyway, it was a great story about it, and I think I saw him on the floor of the draft, and we sort of said hi. But, it was just a one moment where I had 45 minutes with this guy who we're hearing today is as a Canadian icon in so many ways.
James, can I ask, sorry, Mike, to jump in here, but something just occurred to me, and that was, I wonder if you were on the floor of the House of Commons when the Team Canada Summit Series Club was honored on Parliament Hill, and all of the living members of the team came in, and all members of Parliament stood and gave him a standing ovation. And from the camera coverage, I wasn't there, but from the camera coverage, Pierre Poilievre looked across the floor of the House of Commons at Justin Trudeau, and their eyes met, and they both nodded at each other and smiled as if to say, "Isn't this cool?" And it might have been the only kind of collegial moment between the two of them that I have ever seen in my life. But anyway, were you there that day on the floor?
I was there, and I was right behind the Prime Minister. I wasn't going to miss that for anything. I guess that's as close as they ever came to being collegial with one another. You're right. I saw the exchange, and anyway, maybe it was. I'm not sure. He had the same emotional reaction that maybe the Prime Minister or I did. That's for sure. But that was a great day because they came onto the floor, and it's maybe the only time, or one of the very few times in the 10 years I've been in Parliament, where we stopped Parliament midday to bring people onto the floor like that, and nobody batted an eye. And I can remember turning around to one of my younger colleagues who, he thinks that Sidney Crosby's golden goal was the greatest moment in Canadian history. I said, "Let me tell you, as fantastic as it wasn't even close." So I was there on the floor, and then there was a reception afterwards in the speaker's dining room, and MPs and people were coming in and out. And of course, I had great conversations with many of them, including Ken Dryden, and I was like a kid again, spending time with them. And then towards the end, somebody from the Prime Minister's office comes in and says, "Okay, it's time for everybody to leave. It's just players and their families were going down the hall, and they were going to meet with the Prime Minister." And the person who was talking from the PMO knows how passionate I am about the game, and it was Paul Henderson who said, "Hold on a second, I just adopted Maloney. He's coming with us." So I went into this room, and it was just the players and their families, and then the Prime Minister came in. And of course, the group, the Prime Minister spoke, and he spoke brilliantly, but of course the group asked, they tapped Ken Dryden to be the one who spoke on behalf of the team. And as soon as he was finished, I said, God, I wish I had that recorded. Because, again, you're just hanging on every word. And he talked about the 72 series and what it meant to the country, again, in a way that was just, almost brought you to tears. But he started by saying, I want you to think about two numbers, 16 and 21. And I'm scratching in my head trying to think, I'm thinking about the scores of games. I'm trying to do all kinds of different calculations. He says, the population of Canada was 21 million people, and 16 million people watched Game 8.
Amazing.
The final game. It is amazing. And it just, the whole room just went, oh, it was a moment I'll never forget. Unless you were, very, I can remember, I was in grade 2, and I was living in Thunder Bay at the time, and I was mad because my mom let my older brother stay home to watch the game, but I had to go to school. Yeah. It was one of these traumatizing moments you never get over. But we got to school, and of course the school shut down, and they bring these TVs into the classroom, so we got to watch it anyway. So like the whole country was watching. Didn't matter what you were doing or where you were doing, unless it was an emergency of some sort. You were watching that game. But again, he just captured it in a way that nobody else could have.
And just briefly, that's what I meant in the column too about a man of his time. For people who weren't around in 1972, the impact of the Soviets and the Empire and the Dark Empire and how we felt about it, and it was a revival of the Canadian spirit that we'd had in the Second World War, and in the terms of going after the bad guys and being a small country that stood up for itself. And Ken was part of that. And when the other guys on Team Canada, and I tell young people it was a great moment. There were some shameful moments from Team Canada in that, with breaking guys' ankles and things like that. But Ken carried himself with dignity. The irony was that the one team that he had trouble with through all the years was probably the Russians. They seem to have more of a sense how to beat Ken Dryden. Ken was perfectly made for Canadian hockey, but the Russians, if you go back and look at Game 1 when the Canadians lost, Ken just couldn't seem to get the knack of what the Russians were doing. In any event, he had a little bit of trouble with the Russians, but he also in that series, he really was an image for Canada that I thought was really upstanding and go back about it.
Actually, Bruce, the funny thing is, a lot of people talk about the New Year's Eve game a few years afterwards at the Forum as being maybe the greatest hockey game of all time. It was 3-3, the Montreal Canadiens against the Soviet team. Was it the Central Red Army? I can't remember now.
Yep. The Red Army team.
And the shots on goal that night were something like 36-13 for the Montreal Canadiens, which meant that Vladislav Tretiak had a pretty amazing night, and Ken Dryden didn't. And I remember talking to him about that game, which everybody praises as one of the greatest games of all time. Yep. And he always said, not for me. I hated that game. That was a New Year's Eve game, and he never wanted to remember it because he was the second best goalie on the ice that night for sure.
And guys, that was the knock on him. And it's one of the reasons that I think Sammy Pollock maybe underrated him in those negotiations. Everybody at the time, I was a young guy. We tried to act like smart asses. And, he's carried by the team. Anybody could be the goaltender for the Montreal Canadiens and blah, blah, blah.
Poppycock.
And he showed in the year that he was away. And there was a good clip today from the senator. You know who the senator is, Serge Savard, of course. He was talking about Ken Dryden, and he said, look, the guy only faced 12, 15 shots a night, and he had to stay alert and ready for all of those. And a lot of the time, they came on really good chances for the other team, like a breakaway. And he said it was a very hard thing for him to do, and so he had a lot of respect for him. Sometimes it's easier. Goalies will tell you to get 35 to 40 shots, you're in the game the whole time.
For sure.
When you get 15, your pads are cold, your legs and arms are cold, and Ken had to do that many nights.
And he wasn't getting 15 shots on goal when he was a rookie, playing against the Boston Bruins, beating Phil Esposito and Wayne Cashman and Bobby Orr. And he was busy in that series, and he stole the Stanley Cup.
Too. And the saves in the Chicago Blackhawks series, the final, were maybe even better. You remember Phil Esposito calling him an effing giraffe. He said, that effing giraffe, because they didn't know anything about him, right? He'd come out of nowhere.
A fun fact is he's the only goaltender to win a Stanley Cup before he won the Calder Trophy.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? He came up. I remember talking to him about that once. I said, how was it? Because Rogie Vachon, the first-string goalie of the Canadiens, got injured, and Phil Meir was the backup. And Scotty Bowman, I guess, made the decision that they weren't going to go with Meir. They were going to bring this kid up from the Nova Scotia Voyageurs, and they were going to bring him up at the very end of the year and let him play goal. And son of a gun, he played, 6 NHL games and then went through the playoffs, won the Stanley Cup. And then the next year, he wins the Calder Trophy as the best rookie in the NHL. You just can't do that. And he did it.
And sorry, go ahead, James.
No, I was going to say, I have the same reaction. People who don't like the Habs always say, he had the big three, he had this phenomenal team. But the guy, he was an incredible goalie. And you're right, when you're not getting a lot of action, you have to stay on your game. And look, his record speaks for itself. In 2 seasons in a row, he lost 12 games and 8 games. Think about that. Even if the team is as phenomenal as it is, he's got to be phenomenal too. They don't do that without him.
And one of the great ironies too, you're talking about the Boston teams at the time, and you guys probably know this, maybe you don't. But when I was doing my book about the greatest trades in any NHL history, and we made a list of the top 25 of all time, people don't know this. 1964, Ken Dryden was the property of the Boston
Bruins.
And he was traded for 3 guys who I think went on to sell insurance or be car jockeys or whatever it was on both sides of the 4 guys. But then this is 64, and he doesn't make his appearance at the big level until 1970, 71 in that era. And he disappeared. He went, we know where he played. He played at Cornell and all that sort of stuff. But nobody knew who he was. But Boston had him, and they let him go.
You know what? I got a story about that too, Mike, if I can. And that is, I remember asking him one time, because the draft back then was not like the draft today, right? They didn't have it in a huge arena and it was live on television. No, it wasn't. It happened privately, and Ken was informed after the fact that he'd been drafted by the Boston Bruins and then traded in what is clearly one of the worst trades in NHL history. And I remember him telling me that when he was a member of Parliament, he was on the road, I think it was in Timmins. And he was campaigning up in Timmins, and when he was at the Timmins airport, he accidentally bumped into one of the guys that he was traded for in that trade. And they had a lovely conversation, and he said it was so nice to finally meet this guy because he didn't know him at all. And their paths crossed there. I'm on the Google machine right now trying to find out which guy it was, because if you tell me the name, I'll remember, but I don't remember right now. But he said they had just such a lovely brief conversation in the airport and then went their separate ways and never saw each other again. But can you imagine the serendipity of that? And that poor guy who got traded for Ken Dryden, and Bruce, you're right, had no career at all in the NHL, and Ken only became a legend.
It was 2 guys. There were 2 guys involved in coming the other way. But you know what? I bet they never bought a beer in a bar. That was always their thing. I'm a guy who was traded. Oh, yeah.
Here it is. Yeah. Boston traded Dryden along with a guy named Alex Campbell to the Montreal Canadiens for, and bless me if anybody on this call knows these guys' names, Paul Reed and Guy Allen.
We looked them up when we were doing the book.
Household names. Household names.
Well, no, they're not. I'm sorry.
One selling insurance, the other selling cars. And now I'm going to go full hockey wonk here, and please, I apologize for this. The NHL didn't have a universal draft, in fact, until 1970. In the time when Ken was drafted in the 60s, the only guys who were drafted were people who hadn't been signed to what they called a C form. In those days, you went and you signed Frank Mahovlich, you signed all of these guys in their minor league teams and had them. So there wasn't a big amount of guys. I think the most famous guy was maybe Gary Monahan or somebody like that. Everybody else was a nobody. So no one, as Steve says, nobody paid any attention to the draft. It wasn't on TV. There's no reason to put it on TV. And as I say, he just kind of disappeared for a few years, and off he went and played hockey in college. And of course, he was the voice on the broadcast of the Miracle on Ice, sitting next to Al Michaels. He was the analyst. He was also on radio as the analyst for the 76 series, which I still think the 76 Canadian team was the best team of all time. Or maybe...
Yes.
76, or maybe, I don't know.
A lot of Hall of Famers on that team.
Yeah, maybe that was the best one. But anyhow, he did all this broadcasting stuff as well.
You know, Mike, sometimes his emails to me were very, very long, and other times they were very, very short. And apropos of the story Bruce just told, I remember being at some event, and I'm at a table with Glenn Anderson, who was, of course, part of those Oiler dynasties, and he played for the Leafs for a little while. And Glenn Anderson and I got into an argument about who the color commentator was with Al Michaels for the U.S. 1980 Olympic hockey gold medal. And I said, well, it was Ken Dryden. I know it was Ken Dryden. He said, no, I don't think you're right. I think it was somebody else. So I emailed Ken and I said, am I misremembering? I sure thought it was you. I got back a 2-word email. Glenn's Wrong. That was it.
No other words required. Now, I'm a man, sadly, I never got to see Ken Dryden play hockey. Can you believe that? I missed the man's entire career. Just born at the wrong time.
Well, you're too young.
Too young. So
Well,
just before because we talked about how you can't talk about Ken Dryden and just talk about his performance on the ice because he was so much more. But just to put a bow on sort of the hockey career of Ken Dryden. So of course we know he backstops Canada to the win in the 1972 Summit Series. I have a documentary on VHS I recorded. I think it was on Global. It was called Summit on Ice. And there's a quote from Ken in there where he says something like, I realized I could wake up tomorrow the most hated man in Canada. Like some great quote like that. And I'm like, this is like, I can't believe this happened. Like, it's like, was this scripted? This is amazing. So Summit Series, of course, we won. Henderson scores for Canada. But am I right? He played only 8 seasons in the NHL.
Yeah. Nine.
Retired at 30, I think, didn't he?
Yeah, he retired. And
So
he played 9 seasons. Yeah.
9. Okay, so 6 cups in 9 seasons. And how many years in when he took that year off, you guys were talking about him articling? Like the whole idea for a youngster trying to understand. So he wins how many cups and then he takes a year off, he comes back.
He won 2 before.
Okay.
And then he won 4 after he came back.
It's like
And
Michael
4 in a
Jordan
row.
here.
Yeah.
4 in a row.
It's incredible. Yeah, 4 in a row.
4 in a row after he came back, and then he retires again. And the Canadians don't win another cup until '86 when the Oilers decided they all were going to go partying for a year. And they said somebody else won the cup that year. But anyhow, he left, and it wasn't until Patrick Roy came along that the Canadians had a really good goalie again.
Jay,
That's incredible. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I just wonder if I could ask James a question here. I'm really curious about this because, of course, I'm interested in the political angle on him, which is part of what makes him such an interesting story. He ran for the leadership of your party, the Liberal Party of Canada, in 2006. This is the convention that Stéphane Dion won over Michael Ignatieff, who I think was a Etobicoke Lakeshore MP before you.
Yep.
And Bob Ray was there, and Gerard Kennedy, and I think Martha Hall Finley, and Ken, and maybe Carolyn Bennett was in there too. Anyway, I'm very curious, given that he was a hero of yours, and I don't want to call you out here if you didn't, but who did you support for leader at that convention?
I supported Michael Ignatieff, and I'll be honest with you, had Michael not been my MP, I would have been supporting Ken Dryden. That was a tough one for me, Steve, without a doubt.
I can bet.
And I would have just maybe, so the record's clear. I wouldn't have supported him just because I idolized the guy as a hockey player. The guy was a remarkable individual and a passionate Canadian, but a great politician. I didn't serve at the same time as he did, but I remember he came and did spoke at an event for Gene Augustine, who was the MP in Etobicoke Lakeshore for a long time. And it was not long after he was elected. And, I had introduced him, and he got up and spoke about and it was early on in his political career. And, the message he was delivering was, he was talking about civility and the lack of civility and how he was sort of taken aback by the behavior of people in the House of Commons. And it was a very passionate, powerful message. But, it made him more determined to continue doing what he was doing because, he wanted to make change, and that was part of the change. I mean, I never saw the guy speak in a way that was not overly animated, but not angry or upset. The guy was always very calm, very civilized, very passionate, and very inspiring. So,
the flip side of that, though, James, is that he was not a particularly dynamic speaker.
No.
He couldn't rouse a crowd in the way that, a Bob Ray could, or even Michael Ignatieff could. And I wonder if that held him back in his quest to be leader.
Well, I think the level of his...
It absolutely did. That leadership, his speech at that convention in Montreal was brilliant, if you read it. But, he just didn't have the animation. He didn't have the flair and that's not a knock against the man. It's the way he was. But if you listen to him and you think about what he's saying, it was brilliant. But he didn't have the he couldn't get the crowd standing up like he did when he was a goalie.
Slower cadence, if you will, like where.
Yes.
So he's very you could tell he's very thoughtful and considerate, but that doesn't always make for a rousing orator as like Barack Obama or somebody.
Yeah, he was like Harold Pinter used to say, the drama is in the pauses, and the pauses were oftentimes the best parts of Ken's speech. No, because that allowed you the chance to take on what often was an abstract or a conflicting thought. You had to think about it, and he at least gave you that. But when I was at CBC, he had a reputation that everyone wanted him on shows, but Ken didn't want to do a 3-minute hit. He needed to have a little oxygen so he could do these things. And so there was this whole juggling act about how much time have we got? Can we get Ken on there? And can we get him in the package we want? Now, if TVO, for instance, where a certain host had 20, 30 minutes on a night to bloviate about things, maybe it might have been easier.
Okay, I got a story about that because, one of the things that you talk about the pauses, and one of the things when you're an interviewer that you really prize is somebody who actually takes a pause and thinks about what their answer is going to be. And I remember when we did the interview about his book, The Class, about his time at Etobicoke Collegiate Institute, and I said to him, now, Ken, this is me talking. This is not you, because I know you're too modest to say this. But inevitably, when you look at your colleagues that you went to school with, it's inevitable that everybody at some point compares and contrasts how well everybody did. And Ken, let's be honest, if there's a contest, you win. There's nobody else in your high school graduating class that comes close to your level of accomplishment in so many areas. How do you deal with that when you have a class reunion or whatever? And I got one of those pauses. Like he almost didn't know how to answer that, because basically what I was saying to him was, you're just great, and you're greater than anybody else in your class was. And I'm telling you right now, you have to acknowledge that. And it was something he didn't want to acknowledge. He's a very modest guy. He was shy and introverted in that way. And I loved the pause. Because it just showed, as smart as he is, he just didn't, he had to think about his answer. He wasn't quite sure where to go.
Now, Steve and Bruce, we have about 5 minutes more with James, and then I'm making you two stick around to continue talking about the great Ken Dryden. So, James, it's worth noting for the listenership that you and I both went at different times, but you and I both went to Michael Power High School in Etobicoke. And not too far from Etobicoke Collegiate Institute. We're in the Catholic system, but I would say the closest public high school would be Etobicoke Collegiate Institute.
Oh yeah, back in those days. Michael Power's moved since then, but I used to have to walk. I walked to school a lot of times when I was at Michael Power, and I would cut through the park behind Central Arena where Ken Dryden played in his youth. And I used to walk by the ECI students, and of course we had to wear a uniform at Michael Power, and those guys used to make fun of us. So I know exactly where ECI is. I don't live far from there now, but
my nephew goes there now. So hello to my nephew Nate.
There you go. You guys, I do have to jump off. I have to run off, as I said. I apologize. But first of all, listen, thanks for letting me be part of this with the three of you. It's very special. But we're talking about a guy who was you could talk about him for hours. The man was truly remarkable as a hockey player, as an author, as a Canadian, and it's a loss to the country, because anybody who's old enough to remember him, whether it didn't matter who you cheered for, you knew who Ken Dryden was for all of the different things he did. And as I said, I shed a bit of a tear on Saturday morning, because when these childhood memories you have, when something like this happens, it's a powerful moment. I had the same reaction when Guy Lafleur passed away. I got up, I poured myself a cup of coffee, and I saw the news. First thing I did was I sent Ken Dryden an email, and I said, growing up, that you and Larry Robinson and Guy Lafleur, you guys were the guys I watched, and, Canadians lost a hero today, but you lost a friend, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And he wrote back right away and just said, thanks, James, I really appreciate that. And that's the kind of guy he was. He was a special human being, and I talked to some of my colleagues here. I'm with my caucus colleagues. A few of them serve with them, and they said he would go out of his way to come and visit you in small towns and speak at events and help them out, and talk about his dream for Canada. in the future of the country. And that's the kind of guy he was. And we were lucky. We were all lucky to share a piece of our lives with the man. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you. Great to see you.
Thanks for doing this, James. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. I like the Great Lakes beer there in the background, too.
Well, when you come over to make your proper Toronto Mike debut, I have some fresh craft beer for you from Great Lakes Beer.
And a lasagna, too.
And a lasagna as well.
Lasagna. Yeah, save some of that, would you, Bruce? Okay. All right.
See you, James.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, take care.
Okay.
Take care.
So, Steve, before we get back to Ken, can I tell you and Bruce how we got to have James Maloney on the podcast? So
I'm all ears.
Yeah, this weekend there's a event. Bruce, did you make your way to the Taste of the Kingsway while you're in town visiting family?
I was right next to it. I was right at just at the base of the hill, and I could hear all the music. But no, I didn't engage.
Okay. Well, I went there on Saturday and Sunday. Okay, I took my 11-year-old. See, I figured I can never take my 11-year-old Jarvis to see my favorite band of all time because sadly the Tragically Hip is no more, and he was far too young for me to get him to the show I went to in 2016. But the Practically Hip were playing. So yesterday, I said, hey, James Jarvis, we're gonna go to. I think it was at like 5:00 till 6:30, and we biked over and we treated it like it was the Tragically Hip, and he had a great time. So I spent a lot of time this weekend at Taste of the Kingsway, and James Maloney had a booth. And at this time, I was getting emails with Bruce, you, and Steve, and we were putting this together, this Ken Dryden episode. It was coming together very quickly, of course. And then I was chatting with James, and I just said, I can't remember how he came up. I can't remember. I mentioned Etobicoke Collegiate Institute, I think, which is in his riding. And then I mentioned Ken Dryden, and he started talking about growing up a Habs fan and everything. And I said, well, I'm trying to put together this tribute to Ken, like the life and legacy of Ken Dryden. I got Steve Paikin and Bruce Dowbiggin. And then James says, I was just with Steve. So, Steve, were you just with James Maloney at something, like a dinner maybe?
I was on Friday. Yeah, last
Friday.
There's a guy named Justin Van Dett from East York who organized a lunch in East York for, I think, as many as 50 former Toronto City Councillors. And James Maloney, before he was a member of Parliament, was a very short-term Toronto City Councillor. I think he'd actually only been on council for a few months because he joked to me. He said he gave his maiden speech at Toronto City Council, and then almost immediately he gave his exit speech from Toronto City Council because he was only there for a very short time before he moved up to Parliament. So, yeah, that's where I saw him just last Friday.
Too funny. And then I just said, hey, would you like, because at the time we were all going to meet on Zoom. I didn't know Bruce could make his way to the TMDS studio here. And then he's like, I would love to be a part of that. And we just cooked it together. And I thought it'd be kind of neat to get our MP here.
That's what you do, Mike. You bring people together. We love you for it. Even if you are dyeing your hair silver, we love it anyway.
Oh, you know what, Steve Paikin? I know you want the number of the dye I'm using, so I'll just text you that number so you can.
I know you dye your hair gray to give you that added gravitas. I understand, but that's okay. It's a good look for you.
In the words of a famous Montreal Canadian, I put a little gray on the side. My wife likes it, but that wasn't Ken Dryden. That wasn't the Ken Dryden. I think it was.
That was Rocket. 2 minutes for looking so good, Rocket.
That was it. And his hair. When you saw him in those days, the stuff he was putting in his hair made it look green. It oxidized your hair. The early stuff where they were doing that, and guys used it, made your hair look green. So anyhow.
Okay, so if we're keeping track at home here, because there's still some more stories from you two before I dismiss you. Okay. All right, so we have a NHL Hall of Famer, obviously, who wins 6 Stanley Cups. That's hard to believe. Mark Messier won 6 Stanley Cups, 5 with the Oilers, and then 1 with the New York Rangers over like a couple of decades, which was unbelievable. But for a goaltender to win 6, I think that's unbelievable to think about that he won 6 Stanley Cups. So
6 in 8 years.
I know.
Amazing.
Well, I think Jacques Plante won 6 with the Canadiens.
But we're in the original 6 era, right?
League.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 6-team league. I feel like that doesn't count. But okay. So we have the NHL great who also, of course, the 1972 Summit Series. And although I wasn't there for that, I completely appreciate what it meant in the Cold War. And I understand what it means. I'm addicted to those documentaries, those books, and everything about the 72 Summit Series. So we have all that. And taking that year off is unbelievable to me, that in his prime, he takes this year off. But the fact he retired, it's sort of like Barry Sanders, right? Yep. I always thought he was going to come back, Barry Sanders. Like, oh, he'll come back. Never came back. Okay, he was gone. But to retire in his early 30s like that, and then to basically become a lawyer, Okay, let's not, become a lawyer.
I got a story on that, Mike. Can I
Please,
share
go
one
ahead.
on that?
Yeah, as I walk through, I want you to chime in with any story. You too, Bruce. Go ahead, Steve.
Ken told me this story because I wrote a book about former Prime Minister John Turner a few years ago. And to that end, Ken told me a story about when he got together with Mr. Turner, asked him for some career advice. And I guess Mr. Turner put him in touch with a particular law firm or a lawyer that he knew. So Ken went for a job interview, actually. And the guy whom he sees at this appointment is sitting sort of behind his desk with his feet up, and he's looking at Ken's resume, and he's seeing, McGill University and this and that. And then he sort of looks over the resume at Ken sitting there nervously, and he says, "So I gather you've played some hockey in your time." That was it. Anyway,
but for people, for famous people, famous sports people, when you meet somebody who doesn't know who you are whatsoever, I had a neighbor in Calgary, and Grant Fuhr lived in our neighborhood, which is how I came to write his book. But anyhow, we had these friends from Texas, and they lived across the street. And the woman would come over to us and say, "We have such lovely neighbors up here. We love the winter in Calgary and the lovely people." I think he might have been some kind of athlete. I'm not sure. We're going like, this is Grant Fuhr, who was the goalie, maybe the best hockey team that ever was.
Wow.
Well, John Turner put Ken Dryden in touch with a guy named Arden Haynes at the time. And Arden Haynes was running Imperial Oil. And, it was just sort of go out with this guy and pick his brains and see what is out there for you in the legal/business world, that kind of thing. And it was a meeting that didn't have any payoff immediately. But down the road, when Ken wanted to do a series on, I think it was on CBC television about hockey, he called up Arden Haynes, whom he'd met a decade earlier, thanks to John Turner, and apparently Imperial Oil/Esso came in and was the presenting sponsor of this whole thing because of the meeting that they'd had before. The two men knew each other, and those kinds of connections served Ken well. And, it's just, to me, it's just so fascinating that this guy who could be so good on the ice could be so good at so many other things. I just don't know how one person achieves that. Mike, imagine if you would, one day he goes to Premier Bill Davis, who was Ontario Premier from 1971 to 85. And he goes to Mr. Davis after his hockey career is over, and he says, "I'm really interested in education. And I'd like to kind of study it and write a report for your government on some changes that you could make." Like, can you imagine any other player in the history of the National Hockey League, A, making that offer, or B, being accepted by the premier of the day? And Mr. Davis said, "Yeah, go ahead and do it." And Ken spent the next year sitting in the back of classrooms all over the province of Ontario, just watching how kids got educated. And he took it all in. He wrote a report. He presented it to the government. I mean, it's just, to me, it's another example of just how iconoclastic he was.
And he's not just another player, because you might find about, this guy played a little bit here and there, became a lawyer and had some success in other parts of his life. But the fact that this is a Hockey Hall of Famer who backstopped Canada to the victory in the 72 Summit Series and won 6 Stanley Cups in 8 years, like not just another player.
Yeah. The closest guy to that, and it would happen before, of course, was Red Kelly. Red Kelly was playing for the Leafs, and he was a member of Parliament at the same time. He would go up to Ottawa on the train on Monday and spend a couple of days in Ottawa as an MP, and he won, I think, 3 or 4 cups with Detroit and then 3 with the Leafs.
He won 4 with Detroit and 4 with the Leafs.
There you go. So 8. But he never really did anything with it afterwards. That's what makes Steve's story so remarkable, is that Red, he had business connections and things he did afterwards. And of course he coached the Leafs, but he stayed in the hockey realm. And as the only Montrealer, as the only Quebecer on this little chat thing we've had tonight, the impact of him in some respects, and he writes about it in the book, was the Montreal Canadiens were the institution that felt that it had to be a symbol for the province of the two solitudes staying together, the English and the French. And the Canadians were always conscious of, if you had a French Canadian star, you also matched it with an English Canadian star. And Ken writes about it in the book. And a lot of his ideas about Canada, the unity of Canada, what he wanted to bring, came out of that experience in Montreal. It was a referendum year. There was a lot of tension. There was a lot of anger in the dressing room between some of the players. And he wanted to be that guy who was going to bring unity to the rest of the country. And I said this to you a little bit yesterday, Steve. We were talking about another person. Well, we were talking about Bill Davis. And I said, as a person who lives in the West now, there are people who would love to reach out to somebody in Ontario in the East who was like Mr. Davis, who was like Ken Dryden. But those people aren't there anymore. They don't see people that they used to see when they would go to the constitutional meetings. It's so hard to get a coalition going when it's people who are fighting. It's a blood sport that they're fighting. And so Ken understood all of those things, and he had really a holy mission. And I'm sorry that he died before he could see the fruition of it or some level of success for it. But it was important to him.
It's interesting you bring that up, Dobie, because I do remember having a conversation with him about one really significant regret he had during his years playing for the Montreal Canadiens. And that was he never became fluently bilingual.
Yeah.
And it really bothered him. Yeah. And of course, when he got into politics and it came time for him to run for the leadership of the Liberal Party, being fluently bilingual is he was okay, but he didn't have Justin Trudeau's ability in French and English, right? And I sort of looked at him. I remember looking at him and saying, how's it possible you could have been in that dressing room with guys like Guy Lafleur and Guy Lapointe and Serge Savard and Yvon Cournoyer, and you're not perfect in French? How did that not happen? And he didn't really have a good response to it, but it certainly bothered him that his French never got perfect.
Well, because the language of the dressing room, as he said, was franglais. It was both English and French. It was this kind of stew pot of words. Va get ton hockey stick, patiner to the box, and all that. That was the kind of franglais that operated. But there were resentments. Certain of the sovereigntist members on the team, guys like Mario Tremblay, were resentful of the Canadian English guys not speaking. And we've seen that numerous times. It was Saku Koivu was put through the ringer on that in later years. But there was quiet resentment that the Anglo players hadn't necessarily learned to speak. And Scotty was a Montrealer, and he had some French, so he could sort of converse a little bit. But it was the beginning of the that mistrust between the communities, not just in the hockey team, but of course in the province at large.
Okay, so we have the Hall of Famer 72 Summit Series, retires young, becomes a lawyer. Great author. I mean, we talked about sort of like the game, and we talked about this book he wrote. Was it called Classmates? What's it called?
The Class,
about his ECI classmates, which is his most. By the way, that's when I happen to know a gentleman works for the PR of the publishing house that published The Class, and I did my very, very best. I said, look, I'm in Etobicoke. I want to talk about this ECI. I said, I'm no Steve Paikin, but, I didn't quite, I wasn't able to put it together.
You're no Steve Paikin or Steve Paikin?
Both are true. Both are true, right, Steve? Okay, but I want to talk about a period. We only brushed on it briefly, Steve. You brought it up earlier, but this man became president of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I think you talked about, there were, as I recall, as a diehard Leafs fan, sadly, 2 conference finals during this period. And I know...
Well, wouldn't we go for that these days?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's been 4 only 4 that I watched. I don't know in my lifetime there was only 4. There might have been one in the 70s I missed, but or 2. But there was
a semifinal team in 76, I believe it was.
That's the Sittler,
McDonald one. I think it was 76 or 75. Yeah,
and that's the one I missed.
No, it was 70. It was the year after they beat the Islanders, I think. It was
78? 78?
78 they beat the Islanders. I think it was 79. They lost 4 straight to the Habs, but 2 games went in overtime.
Right. Okay, so that's the one I missed. But these 2 of Pat Quinn, you mentioned, Bruce, Howard Berger and Pat Quinn. I kind of need to do a full 90 minutes on Berger versus Quinn, okay? But I was reading, Berger's got a blog I read, and he was writing about how Ken Dryden handled the Maple Leaf Garden sex scandal, the pedophile sex scandal, and it sounds like he might have been the ideal person to be at the helm.
He was brought in for part of the reason that they hired Ken was because they needed somebody who was Simon Pure. That they had sort of sloughed it off. They weren't paying enough attention to it. It became a terrible scandal, and even then politically. They didn't know how to handle it. And Ken was the guy to come along. Steve, you can speak to this too. He was less doing the hockey stuff than he was doing the image of the Leafs in the community. And he was successful at that. He got them through it. Obviously, there was some terrible things that had happened and the whole scandals with the young boys at Maple Leaf Gardens, etc. And he got them through it. And that was a real accomplishment for him. And he didn't get much credit for it because, of course, everybody would blame you for whether the team wins or loses. And frankly, he wasn't down at the rink doing all that stuff that much. He was busy on the other parts of growing the Leafs. The Leafs, as we know it today, the MLSC stuff, had its foundation in those years between him and obviously the people who owned the team.
I think that's all very fair to say. And some of you may remember, some people listening or watching to this may remember, Steve Stavros owned the Leafs at the time, and gave a very poorly received press conference where he was behind the microphones and just did not answer questions and did not present, had no answers and did not seem to grasp the significance of what was going on. And yeah, only Ken Dryden, I think, had the gravitas to be able to give people the sense that justice was going to be had and that things were going to be cleaned up, and he could do it. And so, yeah, I agree, Bruce. He was brought in large measure to handle that. And no, he wasn't an X's and O's guys, and he wasn't overseeing trades and that kind of stuff.
He could have been. He could have been,
yeah.
But it wasn't. It wasn't what he was there for, and he had the discipline to not necessarily interfere in those things. And and there was one time, Stephen, almost ironically, where his sort of measured, slightly boring, slightly pedantic style of speaking, etc., was exactly what was needed. There were too many hotheads, too many people, too passionate John Brophy people surrounding the organization. They needed somebody like Ken who was going to be the principal and get everybody settled down.
I do remember one year when the Leafs were eliminated in the semifinals. We brought him onto a show I used to host called Studio 2 at TVO. And, we talked about how the team did all year and yada, yada, yada. And then I think the last question I asked him was, okay, Ken, so now that the Leafs are out, who do you hope wins the Stanley Cup? And without missing a beat, he just looked at me and he said, I don't care. I thought, yeah, that is exactly the right answer.
Exactly
we don't
what
care.
he should say.
Now that our team's out, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I would have been very surprised if he said anybody else, because at his heart, he was still a hockey guy, too. He was a competitive guy, and it mattered winning and losing. You'd think a guy who was that bright could intellectualize everything and sort of gloss over the top, and he wouldn't have got his feet on the ground. No, in his heart, he was a 12-year-old boy still playing hockey.
But you know what? I do remember, again, in another interview, I remember talking about the Summit Series with him. And we all here around our three microphones remember when Phil Esposito said of the 72 Summit Series, I hated the Soviets so much I could have killed them. I would kill to win that series. And, I never got the sense that Ken Dryden felt the same way about that. I thought he was too intellectual and too thoughtful to feel the same way. But then I had some conversations with Ken in which he kind of led on that, you know what, all this business about, no, we were there to win, and we were there to do whatever the hell it took to win. And I remember asking him about the Bobby Clark slashing Valerie Harlamov on the ankle, and, I might have expected a guy with Ken's pedigree to say, yes, that was very inappropriate and he shouldn't have done that. Mm-hmm. But he didn't say that. And it went to show, to me, it showed that even a guy with his intellect and poise and grace desperately wanted to win that series and was prepared to do whatever it took to save Canada's hockey honor, and they did.
And just as a footnote for people, again, and young fellows in this studio, Ken, it wasn't the first time Ken had played for Canada. Back in the late 60s, Canada had tried to field an all-amateur team. Carl Brewer, in fact, was supposed to be playing for that team. And a lot of guys who went into the NHL later were part of that team. It was Father David Bauer's dream, and Ken was involved in that program as well, and he played. Of course, they had no chance against the Soviets in those days because they were, maybe 100 or 200th on the depth chart for Canadian hockey players. But he was involved at that point, and I think it rankled him. The only time I talked to him, it rankled him because they didn't feel like they had a chance. It was a noble mission, but they didn't really have a chance. And to finally be there in '72 with the team that could beat them, I think it was good for him too, because he'd missed his chance earlier.
One thing we have not talked about here, and that is his time in American collegiate hockey. He went to Cornell in Ithaca, New York, and I'm reminded of this because I got a call from somebody who works at Cornell. They're trying to put together a tribute night for Ken Dryden in the upcoming hockey season there.
Didn't they retire his sweater?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
they definitely retired.
Yeah.
He wore number 1 there, strangely enough, not 29. He wore number 1 there, and they definitely have his sweater retired in the rafters. But, I mean, they won an NCAA championship one year. They're the best hockey team in American collegiate hockey one year. And I think his overall record, if you can imagine this, in however many years he spent at Cornell, I forget if it was 3 or 4 at this point, he had a record of something like 80 wins and 5 losses in all of his time goaltending at Cornell for the Big Red. I mean, just, the people who want to say that he was just sort of a bystander and he was along for the ride because he was on good teams. Yes, he was on good teams, but he was a huge reason why they were good teams. So, cut that out. Give the man his due.
He was playing Boston University all the time, wasn't he?
Hey, stop it now.
That's somebody's alma mater. I'm just kidding. I'm just teasing him about it. And who, of course, now here's your snap quiz, who is another very famous hockey alumnus from Cornell? Another
famous hockey alumnus from Cornell who played in the NHL?
Who's an NHL figure who was alumnus of Cornell?
I do not know.
Can you give us a clue?
Sure, I'll give you a clue. He's the commissioner of the NHL.
Bettman went to Cornell?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Big Red. Now,
wow.
he was
who did he play for again? Remind me.
He probably played for the manager of the team or something along those lines.
Yeah.
He wanted to be the basketball commissioner, and he worked for the basketball people for a while, and then they sloughed him off on the NHL. Well, we were so lucky as hockey fans to get Gary Bettman. But anyhow, that's another show, Mike.
Well, as we wind down here, I was wondering, this is a great question for you, Steve. So you've talked about how competitive he was on the ice, even if you think maybe he'd be a cooler customer. But as a politician, so he, after being president of the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team, he runs for office and he wins. He becomes a member of parliament. He becomes a cabinet minister. But I guess, does he lose in the Harper wave that comes?
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. By the time, Ken told me, I remember asking him, you were rumored to be running in politics for a very long time. Why did you wait till, I think it was 2004, for running for the first time? And he said, I really wanted to have, something to offer people. And he said, when I was 30 and just finished my career in hockey, I really didn't feel like I had anything other than, fame. I didn't feel I had anything to offer people. And so I wanted to have a bit of a career. I wanted to be able to show that I had some accomplishments beyond that. Thus, not just hockey, but education and writing and documentary filmmaking and some business experience and so on and so forth. And he said it really took until 2004 for me to feel like I was ready to run. Now, unfortunately for him, his timing wasn't great because the liberal years, which started in 1993 with Jean Chrétien and then flipped over to Paul Martin in 2004, I guess, they were on the denouement right now. You're coming in, your timing wasn't great. So he came in, he got into government for 2 years, put together that national child care program, and then in 2006, lost when Stephen Harper's side came in and formed a minority government in 2006, and he lost his seat in York Centre, which was thought to be one of the safest Liberal seats in the whole country. Right. And I guess we learned in that election that it was not.
It's a little bit like, obviously, you write about it in your book about John Turner. That Turner he was a victim of bad timing. He had his early chance, and then when his chance came around, it had basically passed. His day, his moment had passed. And for Ken Dryden, when he felt he was ready, it was too late. People in the West weren't reaching out for a Ken Dryden liberal anymore. They were looking for other kind of people. Quebec, I should say, not just the West.
Right, in Quebec. I'm so glad we did this. Ken Dryden, again, sadly, I never got to see the man play, just born at the wrong time. But what a rich life and legacy, and sort of exceptionally great at multiple unrelated disciplines. Like, he shouldn't be that good an author, that good a leader, lawyer, and hockey player. Like, that's just too much, right? That's just too much. So I'm wondering if either of you on our way out here have any final thoughts about Ken Dryden, who we lost at the what I think is a far too young age of 78. I'm just going to throw that out here. 78, when I was young, seemed like an old guy. It doesn't seem as old from where I sit today.
Well, those of us in our 70s consider it to be too very young. Absolutely.
Right.
He was a very young 78, I got to tell you. I mean, he just did not look 78. He Mike, I'll tell you what. I mean, even though Ken and I had a lot of contact over the years, it's natural for me to have asked myself at some point, I think we're friends, but I mean, are we really friends? I mean, we see each other, we spend time together, we email each other a lot. But the guy knows thousands and thousands of people, so I don't presume to think I'm his friend. And yet, as we sit here taping this on a Monday night, tomorrow, there will be a private family funeral, and I'm like beyond honored to say I got invited to go to this. And I'm shocked, but I guess it helps answer the question about whether or not Ken Dryden and I had the kind of relationship I thought we have. I guess we did. And I'm as much as I'm not looking forward to going to the funeral tomorrow, I really am looking forward to going and paying my respects to a guy who I just had immense respect, admiration, and affection for.
Hearing you tell that story, Steve, we're going to close with Bruce. I've decided Bruce is our closer. You are the Tom Henke of this episode, okay? Bringing you
I'm the Dwayne Ward.
Well, I hope I'm not a Jeff Hoffman in that case, then.
No, you're not a Jeff.
That's out of here.
But, you can make the argument Ward better than Henke, so we're in good shape here. I got
yes.
A couple of good ones here. Hearing you, Steve, talk about, were we really friends or was I an acquaintance? He knows thousands of people. Like, just even hearing you talk that out, I'm reminded of a phone call I had with Dave Hodge when Gordon Lightfoot passed away. So Gordon Lightfoot dies, and I get on the phone in a recorded call with Dave Hodge, and Hodge had the similar thoughts, like, I think we were friends, but there's a million people who have had, touched greatness of Gordon Lightfoot, and he's inspired so many. Were we really friends? And you could kind of hear him kind of talking it out, and then coming to the conclusion that, yes, I am proud to consider, Gordon Lightfoot a friend, in addition to being a genius in the musical realm. But so, Steve, you don't want to ever go to Ken Dryden's funeral, but I'm glad you'll be there tomorrow to honor the man and pay your respects.
Thank you, Mike. So will I. It'll be so bittersweet, but yes.
And Bruce?
Yeah, we all have a lot of business friends and people you see all the time, and they seem very important to you. But there's one thing I tell my kids, which is the people who really matter in your life could probably fit into an SUV. At the end of the day,
Right.
You're worried about opinions and
Right.
you're worried about stuff, they could probably fit into an SUV.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, so I'm pleased that you fit into his SUV, Steve, that you mattered to him. And the only thing I would say in conclusion is I would be extremely proud if any of my daughters and sons, granddaughters and grandsons became like Ken Dryden, became accomplished like him. Whether they succeeded in great things or small things, that would be a great legacy for me to see my kids and grandkids do that.
Well said.
Thank you, Bruce Dowbiggin, for making the trek to the TMDS studio. And Mr. Paikin, I'll see you at TMLX 20 on September 25th.
Yes, you will.
Thanks for doing this, Steve. Thanks for doing this, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, indeed.
And that brings us to the end of our 1758th show. Go to torontomike.com for all your Toronto Mike needs. Much love to all who made this possible. That's patrons like you. Go to patreon.com/torontomike and become a member today. Great Lakes Brewery, Palma Pasta, Toronto's Waterfront BIA, RecycleMyElectronics.ca, Blue Sky Agency, and Ridley Funeral Home. See you tomorrow when my special guest is 90210's own Kathleen Robertson.